Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing well. I'm really excited for the story we're diving into today as it's one very close to my heart, and that is The Little Mermaid, originally written by the Danish author Hans Christian Andersen and published in 1837. While the animated Disney version was one of my favorite movies growing up, the original story is quite different, especially in regards to the ending. But we will get to that as I will be telling you the full story in its entirety. So why don't you make yourself comfy with some tea or any other beverage of your choice, and let's get into it. Far out in the deepest part of the ocean lived the Sea King and his subjects. He had a castle made out of coral with tall amber windows and a roof made of shells. He lived here with his mother and 6 daughters, the princesses of the sea. Outside of the castle, each princess had their own little garden plot where they could plant their favorite flowers. The youngest princess, who also happened to be the prettiest of them all, had arranged her flowers like a red sun, and she often fantasized about the world above the surface. All of her sisters enjoyed collecting items from shipwrecks, but the youngest had only one possession she valued: a marble statue depicting a young, handsome boy. She would often listen to her grandmother telling her tales of the world above. She told her of towns, great ships, animals, and the fragrance of flowers or the songs of birds. And the Little Mermaid wanted nothing but to see all of this for herself. Mermaids were allowed to rise to the surface once they had turned 15 years old, and that was still 5 years away for the youngest. So she had no choice but to wait while her sisters rose up one by one each year and returned to the depths with stories of their experiences above the surface. They told of the beauty of the sky, the river, and the storms, and the Little Mermaid listened with eagerness. And then the day finally came when it was the Little Mermaid's turn. On her 15th birthday, her grandmother put a wreath of flowers in her hair, and she rose up to the surface at sunset. Aside from the beautiful sky, she immediately noticed a large ship anchored nearby. She heard music and song coming from it, and she decided to have a closer look. With the help of the waves, she got high enough to look through one of the windows, and she saw a handsome young prince celebrating his birthday. She stayed there for hours, watching the beautiful prince and the fireworks that were shot from the ship. But then the weather changed. A storm built up and the waves got dangerously high. She saw the mast snap and the ship capsize, with all of the passengers and the crew falling into the water. The Little Mermaid searched frantically for the prince, and she found him just as he had lost consciousness. She saved him and kept his head above water through the storm. At dawn, the sea was calm enough for her to swim towards the shore. She stroked his hair from his face and kissed his forehead, but he was still unconscious. She found a nice little bay by a convent with lemon and orange trees in the garden. There she swam up to the shore and left him, and then waited behind the rocks in the water. Eventually, the bells in the convent rang and a group of girls came out and found him. He smiled to them as he woke up, not knowing who it actually was that had saved his life. The Little Mermaid returned to her father's castle in deep despair. She became even more quiet and reclusive than before, and as time went on, she often returned to the spot where she had left him. She saw the orange and lemon trees as they ripened and got harvested, but the prince never showed up. Back in her own little garden, she embraced her statue as it reminded her of him. But she neglected to tend to her flowers, and her garden grew into a wild and gloomy place. Eventually, she decided to open up to her sisters about her longing for the prince. And it turned out that they knew where he lived, and together they brought their little sister up to see his great palace. It was very extravagant, and it had marble steps leading all the way down to the water. After this, the Little Mermaid went there often by herself and watched the prince when he was alone on his balcony. She would also eavesdrop on the fishermen on their ships and became increasingly fond of humans. She wanted nothing more than to experience their world as one of them. One day she asked her grandmother whether it was possible for a mermaid to become human, and she answered that humans have a much shorter lifespan than mermaids, who live up to 300 years. But they had immortal souls, which went on to the afterlife. Mermaids, on the other hand, turn into sea foam upon their deaths. The only way for a mermaid to become human would be if they gain the love of a human, who will then give them part of their soul as they get married. A ball was then held at the Sea King's court, and the Little Mermaid was there as well, and she did a singing performance. Everyone loved her singing, as she had the most beautiful voice in all the Sea Kingdom. After her performance, she was once again reminded of her sorrow, so she slipped away to her little overgrown garden to be with her statue. That was when she made the decision to go and see the Sea Witch, whom she had always feared. But it was worth it if she gave her the possibility to be with her prince. So off she went, or swam rather, across the barren landscapes that were the Sea Witch's domain. She encountered a strange forest of trees that were half animal, half plant. They looked like serpents with 100 arms and slimy fingers that would clutch at anything in their path. Frightened, the Little Mermaid nearly turned back, but she reminded herself of her prince and the possibility of a human soul. So she tied her hair around her head and hurried through the worm-like branches. As she got closer, she saw that each arm was holding things that it had caught, like bones from humans and animals, and even a mermaid whom they had strangled. On the other side of this frightening forest, she found the Sea Witch's house. There she sat with a toad eating from her mouth and water snakes crawling over her chest. Quite the disturbing image, I know. She already knew what the Little Mermaid wanted. Legs, a prince, and an immortal soul. She laughed at her, saying that she will give her a potion which needs to be drunk at the shore before sunrise. It will give her legs, but it will come with excruciating pain. Every step she takes will be like walking on sharp knives and make her feet bleed. But she will be prettier and more graceful than any of the other human girls. She would, however, never become a mermaid again and never see her family again. Should she fail in gaining the love of her prince and he marries someone else, she will die a mermaid death, meaning she will turn into sea foam. The payment for all of this would be her voice. As hard as those terms were, the Little Mermaid agreed, and the witch began preparing the potion using her own black blood. Once it was done, she gave it to the Little Mermaid and cut off her tongue. The mermaid then went back to her father's castle, now with everyone asleep. She took a flower from each of her sister's gardens as memorabilia and rose up to the surface. Eventually, she arrived at the prince's palace and swam up to the marble steps that led down to the water. There, she drank the potion and endured excruciating pain as her fishtail transformed into human legs. She collapsed from the pain, and when she woke up it was morning and she found the prince standing before her. She realized then that she was naked, so she wrapped herself in her long hair. The prince asked who she was, but of course she couldn't speak. He then took her with him into his household and gave her fine silk clothes. Just like the witch had said, every step she took was like walking on knives, but she was also very graceful in her movements and turned heads wherever she went. She remained in the prince's household as a kind of guest/servant. There were other girls there as well, and when one of them sang to the prince, he smiled to her, which made the Little Mermaid jealous. But then she went on to dance for him, and she gave such a beautiful performance, and the prince was so delighted that he took her on as his personal companion. He called her his little foundling and allowed her to sleep on a velvet cushion outside his door, which is a bit strange, I must say, like she was a guard dog or something. But he also took her with him riding and exploring, and generally spent most of his days with her. Still, the Little Mermaid endured searing pain every step that she took, and at night she would go down the marble steps to cool her feet in the sea. One night, as she did so, her sisters came up to the surface, expressing their grief over her loss. This became a pattern every night, and once she even saw her father and grandmother in the distance. They rarely went up to the surface, so this was a clear sign of how much they missed her. The days passed, and the Little Mermaid's love for the prince grew even greater. He loved her too, but not in the same way. It was more like a friend-zone kind of love. One day, as they were in his chamber, he told her of a young maiden of the convent that had saved his life as he lay dying on the shore after the shipwreck. He had only seen her twice, but she was the only woman he could see himself loving. But as she belonged to the convent, it wasn't possible for him to pursue her. He then embraced the Little Mermaid and kissed her forehead, saying that she reminded him of this maiden. The Little Mermaid was sad that she couldn't say that she was the one who had saved him from drowning, but she was comforted by knowing that this maiden that he loved belonged to the convent. Shortly thereafter, the family put pressure on the prince to get married, and they already had a bride in mind, a princess from a neighboring kingdom. And the prince was anything but happy. He spoke about it to his foundling, the Little Mermaid, saying that his parents want him to sail to this other kingdom to meet the princess. He had agreed to go there, but he would refuse to marry her. If they insisted on forcing him to take a bride, then he would rather have his little foundling. And then he kissed her, on the mouth this time. And you can imagine how happy she felt about this. So off they went on the ship. The Little Mermaid went with him, of course, as he wouldn't go anywhere without her. On the ship, the prince told her stories of the sea, obviously not knowing that her knowledge of it was far more extensive than his own. At night, when the prince and most of the crew were sleeping, the Little Mermaid sat and watched the water. Eventually, she saw her sisters come up to the surface, looking worried about her. Then they arrived at the other kingdom, where lots of festivities awaited them. They took part in the celebrations, but the princess wasn't there yet. They were told that the princess was being educated far away from there and would be with them soon. The Little Mermaid was anxious about the arrival of the princess. Was she really as beautiful as they said? Then that would be a problem. Then the princess finally arrived, and lo and behold, she was none other than the mysterious maiden from the convent whom the prince was in love with. She lived there for her education, not because she had taken religious orders. The prince was overjoyed at seeing her again. All of his hopes had been fulfilled. He told the Little Mermaid of his joy, saying that she would be happy for him as her devotion to him was so great and sincere. Those are his own words. There was no time to waste, and the wedding was set up immediately. The church bells were ringing, and the bride and groom were standing before the bishop. The Little Mermaid stood behind them, holding the bride's train. But she could neither see nor hear the ceremony, as her thoughts were entirely occupied by all that she had lost. That evening, the reception was held at their ship on the way back to the prince's kingdom. Everyone was dancing and celebrating, and the Little Mermaid danced more elegantly than ever before, despite the pain she endured. She knew this would be the last night that she saw her prince, so she was determined to make the most of it. She had given up everything for him: her home, her family, her voice, and now her life, and he knew nothing of it. Once people had gone to bed that night, the mermaid saw her sisters come up to the surface. They had cut off their hair, which they said that they had bartered to the sea witch in exchange for a way to save their little sister. She had given them a magic dagger with the instruction that the little mermaid must take this dagger and plunge it into the heart of the prince. His blood on her feet will transform her back into a mermaid. However, she would have to do it before sunrise, and that was only minutes away. The little mermaid took the dagger and went into the tent where the prince was sleeping with his new bride. Her hand trembled as she watched them sleeping peacefully in each other's arms. Unable to kill her prince, she instead threw the dagger overboard, where it disintegrated into the water. Afterwards, she jumped overboard herself, and as soon as her body touched the surface, she turned into sea foam. But she didn't feel like she had died. All of a sudden, there were these beautiful, translucent beings all around her. They welcomed her, saying that they were the daughters of the air. They are tasked with bringing cold air to hot places and spreading the perfume of flowers. They explained that the little mermaid had no immortal soul, but through her deeds when she was alive, she had raised herself to the spirit world. She would now go on to serve with the other daughters of the air for 300 years, after which she would be granted an immortal soul. The little mermaid watched as commotion broke out on the ship. The prince and his bride were looking out over the water as they had heard that she had thrown herself over. She floated up to them, creating a cooling breeze over her prince, and gave his bride a kiss on the head, after which she rose through the air with the other spirits. The end. Firstly, I want to talk about the ending, because it's rather unusual for fairy tales to have such a grim ending where not only is the protagonist's heart broken, she also dies. It's just so sad. As a reader, you want the Little Mermaid to have her prince and live happily ever after. But I suppose there is some consolation in that she did find bliss in death. She got to join the Daughters of the Air, and through the spirit world, she would continue her existence above the surface, and eventually gain an immortal soul. So, in a way, she did get one of the things that she wanted. I also want to mention that the fairy tales from Hans Christian Andersen have a special place in my heart. While I'm not Danish, I did grow up in the south of Sweden, less than an hour from the Danish capital Copenhagen, in fact, and I remember so many of his stories from my childhood, many of which are internationally known as well, such as Thumbelina, The Ugly Duckling, The Emperor's New Clothes, The Princess and the Pea, The Snow Queen, and so forth. They are just a huge part of the cultural heritage of the region, and especially The Little Mermaid, who has been immortalized through the famous bronze statue of her by the Østerbro Harbor in Copenhagen. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. I remember when I was a child, we would go to the big amusement park in Copenhagen called Tivoli, and there they have a ride which is just a bunch of animatronics showing various scenes from Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, and I absolutely loved it. It was so magical. I would go on it again and again until my mom got sick of waiting for me. Anyway, that was a side tangent. No matter how much I love Hans Christian Andersen's stories, I have to admit that I prefer the 1989 Disney adaptation in this case. The story itself is more fleshed out, of course, and it has a happy ending, but that's not necessarily why I prefer it. The book prince is just not very nice in my opinion. He's just incredibly self-centered. I can't see what the mermaid sees in him, apart from a beautiful appearance, I suppose. And there's just something really gloomy and depressing about the book. It doesn't feel like a magical fairy tale that sparks your imagination. Or maybe that's just my perspective, as I was already familiar with the ending. Or maybe just my bias, since I watched the animated version so much as a child that is basically my headcanon. As I was researching when writing the script for this video, I came across a theory that The Little Mermaid was actually inspired by Andersen's love for another man. This man, Edvard Collin, went on to get married, whereas Andersen never married. It doesn't specify if there was unrequited love between them or if it simply was a matter of the time period, as same-sex relationships were still heavily stigmatized in the 1800s. I don't have any hard sources for this, but if that was the case, then there is so much more depth added to the story. And some elements make a bit more sense when viewed in this light, such as being unable to tell your love how you truly feel about them and being happy for them in public when on the inside your heart is broken. I just found that theory really interesting, and it adds another layer of sadness to the origins of this beloved fairy tale. Now, I'd like to know what you all watching think of this story. Do you prefer the original compared to the Disney adaptation? Let me know any thoughts you might have in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, then make sure to give it a thumbs up, as that is super helpful to me, and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more videos like this. Thank you all so much for watching today, and I hope to see you back next time.